Born in Westmoreland Country, on February 22, 1732, George Washington was the eldest child of Augustine Washington. His initial training incorporated the investigation of arithmetic, reviewing the works of art and guidelines of affability. In Washington's life, he had gone over the French and Indian War and the American Revolution. Under the lead of Washington, the confidence of the troop was raised and he had become massively in status amid the war. Finally, he won the fight.
The story of George Washington and the cherry tree is probably one of the most famous. However, it was most likely invented by the author Mason Locke Weems, who published a book about George Washington shortly after he died. The book included the following short story about young George, to demonstrate his moral character. When George was about 6 years old, he was made the wealthy master of a hatchet, of which, like most little boys, he was immoderately fond, and was constantly going about chopping everything that came in his way. One day, in the garden, where he often amused himself hacking his mother's pea sticks, he unluckily tried the edge of his hatchet on the body of a beautiful young English cherry tree, which he barked so terribly that I don't believe the tree ever got the better of it. The next morning the old gentleman, finding out what had befallen his tree, which, by the by, was a great favorite, came into the house, and with much warmth asked for the mischievous author, declaring at the same time that he would not have taken 5 guineas for his tree. Nobody could tell him anything about it. Presently George and his hatchet made their appearance. "George," said his father, "do you know who killed that beautiful little cherry tree yonder in the garden?" This was a tough question, and George staggered under it for a moment, but quickly recovered himself, and looking at his father, with the sweet face of youth brightened with the inexpressible charm of all-conquering truth, he bravely cried out, "I can't tell a lie, Pa. You know I can't tell a lie. I did cut it with my hatchet." "Run to my arms, you dearest boy," cried his father in transports. "Run to my arms. Glad am I, George, that you killed my tree, for you have paid me for it 1,000-fold. Such an act of heroism in my son is more worth than 1,000 trees, though blossomed with silver, and their fruits of purest gold." Mason Locke Weems, 1806. George Washington began his working life when Lord Fairfax asked him to accompany him on a surveying trip. Washington was 16 years old. On this trip, he gained valuable skills in surveying and cartography. He continued to work as a surveyor for the next 2 years. In between surveying trips to different areas of Virginia, George Washington continued to live with his half-brother, Lawrence Washington, who would teach him skills he would need as a soldier in the military. In 1752, Lawrence Washington died and George became a plantation owner and farmer. Despite the relatively small amount of time he was able to spend working as a farmer, Washington enjoyed his life as a gentleman farmer, overseeing farm operations and the creation of beautiful landscaping. He believed that it was the noblest profession. The next job that Washington took on was that of a soldier. The governor of the colony of Virginia appointed Washington as our major and sent him on a mission to the Ohio River Valley. Washington fought in the first battle and many of the subsequent battles of the French and Indian War. A few years into the war, Washington was promoted to colonel and continued to serve as a soldier in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. When the French and English finally came to an agreement and the war was over, Washington returned home to work as a farmer once again in 1759. Beginning in 1765, Washington served as a member of the House of Burgesses of Virginia. He worked hard as a general and demanded the same from the man he commanded. When the war was over in 1783, Washington resigned from his commission as the commander-in-chief of the new country's army. He once again returned to Mount Vernon, where he hoped to live the remainder of his life as a gentleman farmer. However, When the Constitutional Convention met in 1787, Washington was chosen as one of Virginia's delegates. George Washington was chosen to be the president of the Constitutional Convention. For 3 long months, from late May to mid-September, the members met in closed rooms. Finally, they came to an agreement and the members signed the Constitution on September 17, 1787. Once the Constitution was ratified, the people elected George Washington as their first president.
Guys, what were contributions of George Washington?
First, helped Congress with the selection of the Bill of Rights, the initial 10 changes to the Constitution, in 1791, ensuring the privileges of the American individuals. Second, organized the initially United States Cabinet and the executive branch, fabricating a foundation equipped for supporting future presidents. Third, issued the Proclamation of Neutrality, building up the United States as an impartial country in the contention amongst Britain and France, and liberating the country from pointless contribution in outside clashes. Fourth, signed the Treaty of San Lorenzo, opening the Mississippi River to American route. Fifth, adopted measures to determine the raising obligation emergency, for example, support of a program that repaid the state's Revolutionary War obligations. Sixth, suppressed the Whiskey Rebellion, an uprising by agriculturists who were disappointed by the administration's forced extract on bourbon. Raised more than 12,000 troops to suppress the uprising and persuade individuals regarding the value of the expense.
George Washington's famous home, Mount Vernon, was owned by the Washington family since 1674. It was established by George's great-grandfather. The plantation is located in Fairfax County, Virginia on the banks of the Potomac River. In 1735, Augustine Washington built a 4-room, 1.5-story house on the property which, at the time, was called Little Hunting Creek Plantation. When Augustine died, George Washington's eldest brother, Lawrence, inherited the plantation and renamed it Mount Vernon. Lawrence died in 1752. 2 years later, Lawrence's widow allowed George to lease the house and land which covered about 2,000 acres. George became the sole owner of Mount Vernon in 1761. George was a hard worker and an excellent farmer. During his life he expanded the property to nearly 8,000 acres.
At the end, I would say you that George Washington is the best one because his contribution to the U.S. history cannot be overemphasized. He was a man who never went for less. Moreover, Washington was a very trustworthy and courageous leader who, apart from people believing in him, he believed in himself. As we see, Washington as a leader will be outstanding as he has great achievements including leading troops to war where they emerge victorious. George Washington's honesty is a great quality that I will consider using to convince others on his greatness.